Did you know that every year, over 150,000 people die as a cause of the climate crisis? And that figure is only going to exponentially increase. Today, I will be going over some of the effects of this crisis and the steps that we need to take to stop it. My name is Daniel Sheth, and I'm an 8th grade student here at the American School of Madrid. I grew up in New York City, having moved to Spain just over 2 years ago. To start, I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience with this crisis. The first time that I learned of it was on a chilly morning in New York City. I woke up to soot on my window. If you've lived in an industrial city, it is likely that you've heard of or even seen soot. It is a gray ash that builds up on surfaces like windows. So I woke up to the soot, and I was a bit curious about it, but I didn't pay it much attention as my parents cleaned it immediately. But another 2 weeks passed, and the soot was back. Now I was a bit worried. Where was this soot coming from? My parents cleaned it, and 2 weeks later, the soot had built up again. Now I was getting frantic. Was someone purposely planting the soot on my window? I stayed up all night waiting for that night-prowling, wall-climbing graffiti artist to come spray paint my window with soot. But he never came. When I asked my parents of this soot, they said it came from the Ubers, taxis, cars, and factories of New York City. My young self had reached a newfound understanding about this soot. Those Ubers were the graffiti artists. However, as I continued to grow up in New York City, numerous climate-related events began to shape both my understanding and apprehension for this crisis. One such event was Hurricane Sandy. If you've lived on the East Coast in the past decade, it's more than likely that you've heard of or experienced this terrible hurricane. It wreaked havoc with over $70 billion in reparation costs, 650,000 homes damaged, and more than 8 million people left without electricity. Most of the coastal areas in New York City were left underwater, and hundreds, if not thousands, were forced to evacuate. My residence was in one of the lucky pockets that still had electricity. Our friends and families from surrounding neighborhoods came to live with us, and the air mattresses began to pile up. With most of the supermarkets either shut down or out of supply, we had to ration lentils and rice. When the storm finally blew over, New York was left devastated. So how can people like you and humanity as a whole stop events like Hurricane Sandy? Well, the impetus for these events is the climate crisis, and we'll get into the science of that a bit later. First, let's talk about the first step in stopping this crisis. That is decommissioning or shutting down fossil fuel plants. Fossil fuel plants are places where fossil fuels, like coal and oil, are burned and turned into energy. On the surface, this seems pretty cool. But when we burn these fossil fuels, they emit heat-trapping particles that end up in our atmosphere. In turn, they have devastating effects on our planet. One such effect are hurricanes like Sandy. As a lot of the heat that gets trapped in our atmosphere ends up in our oceans. This makes ocean-based storms like Sandy occur with more strength and destruction. So why haven't we shut down these fossil fuel plants yet? Well, 3 things stand in our way. Number 1, what happens to all major fossil fuel companies? Number 2, what do we do with decommissioned fossil fuel plants? And number 3, what happens to the employees of those plants? The answer to the first question is a difficult one indeed, as if we are to ban fossil fuels, these companies are sure to collapse. However, there is another option. these companies can begin expedited transitions to the green energy sector. They can begin installing solar panels and windmills, as opposed to going bankrupt when the world either runs out of or bans fossil fuels. Now for the next issue. What happens to decommissioned fossil fuel plants? Well, globally, fossil fuel operations take up thousands of square kilometers of space. If only a small fraction of these were repurposed for solar panels or windmills, the world could easily meet and surpass the current energy levels that we receive from coal. So, repurposing coal plants may be these companies' best chance at survival. And although a change of this scale won't occur overnight, its rapid completion is imperative if these companies wish to stay in business. Now for the third and arguably largest issue. What happens to the employees of these plants? If these plants are shut down, these employees will lose their jobs. The most ideal solution is a government policy intervention that coerces companies to prioritize those who lost their jobs at fossil fuel plants for jobs working in the green energy sector. That means that if you lose your job after your fossil fuel plant gets shut down, the government will ensure that your company gives you a new job working with solar panels and windmills. So now that we've gone over step one of the solution to stopping this crisis, let's move on to a second effect: droughts. Another game-changing climate-caused event was the Sao Paulo Drought of 2014, which is misleadingly named, as it ended up lasting for far more than 1 year. In 2014, Sao Paulo State in Brazil nearly ran out of water. The effects of the droughts lasted until 2017, when they finally began to lift. Can you imagine having to ration water and food for years? Can you imagine not being accustomed to electricity, like that studio light up there? Well, that's exactly what the residents of Sao Paulo State had to endure for the span of this deadly drought. The Sao Paulo drought was a direct result of the extreme heating in our atmosphere, as the heat-trapping particles in the air suck up more of the moisture in the ground, causing longer and deeper droughts. The Sao Paulo drought is yet another sign that this crisis is already upon us and that we need to act now. But what if we are able to act now? What if we are able to complete step one of this crisis, decommissioning fossil fuel plants? What is step two? Well, fossil fuels produce 80% of the world's energy, so a new energy source would be necessary. Luckily, numerous solutions exist. The cheapest are solar panels and windmills. The price of these technologies has been dropping dramatically, to the point where solar panels are cheaper than most, if not all, fossil fuels. We will need places to install these technologies. As I mentioned earlier, decommissioned fossil fuel plants could be the place. However, there are many other options. Let's start with offshore windmills. You can see it up there. Offshore windmills are windmills that are essentially in the ocean. With higher wind speeds offshore, these windmills can produce far more energy. If you've been to Northern Europe, you've probably seen quite a lot of them. But though currently they only provide 1% of the world's energy. Luckily, the cost of this technology has been dropping as fast as solar panels. In fact, cost estimates for this technology in 2050 are being met in 2020. Now, in terms of solar energy, there are even more opportunities. Solar power is the most abundant source of energy on planet Earth. In fact, enough of it hits our planet every hour to power the entirety of humanity for a year. That means since this day started, enough solar energy has hit our Earth to power the entirety of humanity for 14 years. Now, we'll need places to install solar panels. Although placing them on fields and plains as far as the eye can see is an option, is it the most viable? Well, it takes up a lot of space and really isn't. A simple solution is having the option of installing solar panels on one's buildings and homes. This would create buildings that could, for the most part, rely on themselves for energy. Not only would it create more feasible installment locations for solar panels, but it would also allow the energy providing industry to continue, as it is more than likely that these buildings will need extra energy from external sources. So, now that we've gone over step 2 of the solution, let's look at a third effect: wildfires. Any American here has probably heard of the California wildfires. In 2020, we lost over 10,000 structures to these fires. In 2017 and 2018, we lost over $20 billion to these fires. And in the past 4 years alone, we've lost over 25 million acres to these fires. That's the equivalent of 100,000 square kilometers, or 1/5 the landmass of the country that we're in right now, Spain. That means that if we had those fires here in Spain, it would take only 20 years for all of your homes, all of your possessions, all of your cars to be burned. These fires are a direct consequence of the climate crisis, as hotter temperatures make wood more prone to burning. And hotter temperatures are all we are going to get with more heat-trapping particles in our atmosphere. So let's talk a little bit about those heat-trapping particles. You've probably heard of carbon dioxide. It's the most common heat-trapping particle. But is it the most powerful? Can it trap the most heat? Well, unfortunately, there are quite a few fossil fuels that can trap far more heat than carbon dioxide. Luckily, most of them are produced in extremely small amounts that we don't really have to worry about. But there is one fossil fuel. One fossil fuel, and there's 500 million tons of it are emitted annually. And it's not just 5 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, not just 10 times, not even lucky 13 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. No, it's 84 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. It can trap 84 times the heat that carbon dioxide can. And this fossil fuel is methane. And methane is emitted from a very dangerous animal: cows. When a cow farts or burps, they release a massive amount of methane. In fact, the average cow fart traps the same amount of heat as a car driving 50 miles. And worldwide, cows contribute more to climate change than the entirety of the transportation sector combined. So, what's the solution here? Is killing all cows even viable? Is committing mass cow genocide even moral? Well, luckily, that's not the solution. If you didn't know, cows are farmed and bred for their primary export: beef. So the solution here is to stop farming cows. Well, this will require a total ban on beef, which is quite a big thing. In fact, a decade ago, I don't think any climate expert in their right mind would have proposed a ban on beef. Because to be honest, all the alternatives that we had to beef were those veggie burgers that looked like they came out of the dumpsters. So, what has changed? Well, we have new technology that allows us to create plant-based burgers, like the Beyond Burger. 90% of Beyond Burger consumers say it tastes exactly like beef. And of the 10% that don't, 99% say it tastes just as good. So if we do have a viable alternative to beef, why have we not even begun the process of banning it? Why did we not see Joe Biden and Donald Trump debating about beef policies? Well, that's because one thing has stood in the way of a ban on beef: beef producers. Beef producers like Tyson and JBS have long opposed a ban on beef. For like fossil fuel companies, it will result in their companies going bankrupt. However, unlike fossil fuel companies, beef producers have not even begun to look at viable plant-based alternatives. And it is not likely that they will do so without extra pressure from governments and organizations. So, what's the takeaway from all this? We've gone over 3 steps to stopping the crisis. 1, shutting down fossil fuel plants. 2, installing green energy. 3, stopping cow farming. We've also looked at 3 devastating effects: hurricanes, droughts, wildfires. And these aren't even all the effects. So how do we stop this crisis? Well, we must remember that one person alone cannot stop this crisis. One person alone cannot demand that JBS and Tyson stop producing beef. It will take a concentrated effort of people to demand that JBS and Tyson begin a transition to plant-based burgers. It will require not just one government, but a concentrated effort of governments to demand a ban on beef. It will require not just one person, but an organization of people to choose the Beyond Burger over the beef burger. It will require not just one government, but multiple governments to choose to create a solar and wind-powered economy and world. For we must remember, the climate crisis is not a competition, but rather a unified effort to preserve our decaying planet. Thank you.